Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back. Today's episode of the BS Podcast is a special one, a bit of a weird one. And I have here with me Rob Haisfield, a previous guest on the show from earlier on in season 1. If you didn't listen to that episode, I highly recommend you do. He and I had a lot of fun, and there was a lot of great little insights that we chatted about, some stuff related to behavior design generally, but kind of motivation, self-regulation, gamification, all the shins that you can think of. So definitely recommend you check that one out. So anyways, why is this a special or a weird one? Well, because Rob came to me yesterday or the day before and said, hey, I have an idea. Let's do, I think the name he gave it was a reverse interview. And essentially, as you can probably guess, it is Rob interviewing me. And at first, no, you know what? I love the idea right away, if I have to be totally honest. And maybe because it's a bit selfish, it's finally I get to talk and do all of the answering the questions instead of just asking the questions. But it's also a bit of a test, I think. I must say, I have, as the podcast host of the show, I have the easy job of asking questions. The people who have it hard are my guests, because unlike some other shows, I don't give anyone a list of questions or topics. I really just do it off the cuff, and we sort of go where the conversation leads us. But asking questions is easy. Answering them is a whole other thing, I think. So I am up for the test, and I hope, in the conversation that we have and in the questions that Rob asks me, some insights will be learned, and maybe listeners you'll learn a little bit about me and my past and where I'm headed in the future. So with that, over to you, Rob, and please be gentle.
No promises there. No promises. So as he already explained, I'm Rob, behavior design and gamification consultant, and also a behavioral product strategist for Sparkwave. You can find more information about me on the episode that we did together, but really this is about you, Nick Hobson. Nick Hobson has a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Toronto. He's a behavioral science strategist, designer, prolific content creator. Gosh, he just posts so much content, and it's all great. He's published in Business Insider, Forbes, Inc., Vice, Quartz, Psychology Today. His research has been covered in Hidden Brain, History Channel, Discovery Magazine, Time. He currently runs The Behaviorist, a consultancy that works on organizational behavior change, but also like on all aspects of behavior change, really. Like, he's worked with apps, he's worked with brands. He is a special projects advisor in culture change for BE Works. He's the and the point that I really want to just get across, though, through all this, is that Nick Hobson is a super impressive guy, and also super modest and super humble. He's on a more personal level, he's one of those rare people that's able to be a mentor, a peer, and a friend all at the same time. So I'm really excited to dive into this. Nick, are you ready?
Yes, and wow, thank you, Rob. Those are some seriously kind words. I really appreciate it coming from you. So I am ready. Let's do this.
Great. So this right here is about to be a little bit of revenge for all of the guests who have been on this show, who you start off with just like a whopper of a question. But what I'm really curious about is like you've talked with so many interesting, incredible behavior change practitioners. And as a result, you've gained a very wide breadth of understanding about behavioral science and its application. So I'm curious, if you're attempting to change behavior, what do you think are the important questions that need to be asked about people?
Wow, that is a whopper indeed. Um, but I had it coming. Yeah, first of all, I will say, and I'm going to answer this question in a very roundabout and tangential way because that's sort of my style. But there will be an arc to it, I hope. But first, I want to say is I have learned, and I say this with the utmost honesty, I have learned so much more in the last, how long have I been doing this? 7 months or so, 6, 7 months, from the guests like yourself who I've had on the show. I've learned so much more from them than I have in the 3, 4 years as a consultant or practitioner, behavioral practitioner, and also more than I learned as an academic in graduate school when I was doing my PhD. So there's something to be said about having conversations with really smart and motivated and down to earth people. It's this weird sort of arrangement where I ask people to come on my show, and most everyone, the response rate is like 95% say yes. And I learn, it's very selfish. I learned so much from them. And hopefully there's this reciprocation that they enjoy being on the show, and we get their work out there to the masses, and we get their name out there. So yes, I've learned a ton. Um, what I will say next is the field of behavioral science or behavioral economics or behavioral insights, again, whatever you want to capture it, whatever name, is so broad. And I knew that before I started the podcast, but it's only been confirmed for me since starting the show. Um, there are people in every different corner of behavioral blank doing every possible thing you can imagine, and that is reflected by that's reflected in the just by the people I've had on the show. So I think back, and there's been 30, 35 guests, and they've ranged from academics to policy, um, people in policy, to product designers and app designers, to health behavioral practitioners, to financial products and financial services and folks in that as that area of specialization, to risk, to audit. So anyways, point being, they cover all ground. um, and so we the one thing I think behavioral practitioners are careful to say is that the context matters a great deal. So what works in context A isn't going to generalize or carry over to context B. And actually, just recently talking to Jason Collins, which stay tuned, that episode will be released in 2 weeks, folks. He talks frequently and often about this idea of the generalizability crisis, which is similar to the replication crisis that we as psychologists are facing. And the generalizability crisis is that, essentially the findings or the effects we find in lab or in practice in context A aren't going to necessarily generalize out over to and carry over to context B or C. And so what that means is there's really no universal basis. There's no cure all. There's no thing that's going to work in every instance. There's so much nuance when it comes to human behavior. So to your question, Rob, what are the things that change? I am going to totally dodge that for now, and then maybe we'll sort of get to a good answer. But for now, I
Hmm.
think what I want to say is it's which is the worst answer ever. It depends. It depends who your user is, who your customer, who your employer, who your citizen, who the target audience is, and what behavior you're trying to change. Um, and I this also fits into this this argument that I think, and this is the direction we're going as a field, is we came out in like 2010 in our infancy as a behavioral science field, and it was all about nudging. It was like you can go in at this, along the spectrum of human behavior, and you can intervene or nudge at this particular decision point, and haha, you see this like wonderful outcome that you're trying to measure and change. uh, that still works, and that it's done through little messaging and letters and emails and communications and these sorts of things. But the toolkit, the nudging toolkit approach, is we're so much more than just that. um, I think behavior is so, I don't think, I know human behavior is so complex, it's so context sensitive and context dependent, that what is going to work is just, it really depends on who the person is, what the context is, and what is the ideal behavior change that we're trying to go after.
That's great. And I think that's something that I admire a lot about you, is just your general mindset of around behavior change. Is it's very much of the fox versus the hedgehog, right? Like it's you don't have one grand theory to cover everything, right? Like you have many theories and many tools that all see their usage when appropriate, right? And I think that's something that practitioner work can definitely drive you towards. Would you agree?
Yes. When I came out of PhD, I was the dogmatic scientist. I was the dogmatic psychologist, and I believed wholeheartedly that science generally, but behavioral science and psychology specifically, could fix everything. I don't think that's the case now, 4 years later. Um, I still love the field. I'm still enamored by its potential for what we can do, but we're not special. Like, we just really had a stroke of luck in the last decade because some really smart people wrote some really good books, and some smart people followed them with other books and other companies and organizations and agencies, and there was just this sort of perfect storm of things, a confluence of different factors coming together, and so we sort of hit the mark, and I'm glad we did, but that doesn't make us as behavioral scientists better, or more relevant, or more useful than, say, an anthropologist or a sociologist or an organizational theorist, um, or a management scholar or a designer, or even like an artist. Like every profession and every trade has its value. And so I'll say that first, and then second, for me, like, the fox versus the hedgehog. I I hope that's true. I hope that's how I do my work and how I frame problems and how I engage with clients and have conversations with collaborators and partners. The one thing that I go to, that I will always go to, is the scientific method. So I am a scientist, and I just love the scientific method so much. And I think that's the one thing that will always be there for me. So theories will change, they'll get upended, they'll fail to replicate. What will hold as true in context, as we were saying earlier, what will hold true as in context A won't hold as true in context B. Um, things will always be in flux, and we will always be chasing after the truth, or what a former mentor of mine called truthiness. There's no such thing as truth. Like this idea that we're progressing towards truth as a science or as scientists is sort of an illusion. So as we continue to proceed towards truthiness, things are going to change. But what isn't, at least in my mind, is how we do the work, which is how we ask questions, frame hypotheses, test predictions, run experiments, gather data, analyze data, and all that sort of in between that happens as part of the scientific process. So that's for me, that's what I go to. Um, but there's value in people who don't necessarily run experiments. Also, experiments have their time and place, and so you can't force them in when they don't really make sense to do.
Right, right. And well, so one thing that I'm also curious about then along those lines, because you said the word truthiness in there, which I love a lot. And in a thought experiment, you know, um, was posed a while ago by another one of my mentors, Spencer Greenberg, where he said, imagine somebody has a gun to your head and says, "Find the truth of this matter." Right? Is an experiment the only way to do that? I don't know about that. So what? But the scientific method seems like it's a little bit broader than that, and experiments are one method of that. So how do you think about the various sorts of evidence you might receive about truthiness from all of these other professions that you would say, are just as special as applied behavioral science?
Hmm. It's interesting you bring that up. There's a recent paper by my PhD mentor on experiments, and I'm trying to remember the name. Something about the limitation of experiments. I'm out cheating because I'm googling. But you know what? I'm not going to find it. So that's because I think it's a pre-publication. I actually don't even think it's in press yet. But essentially, they're saying that psychology, and which is behavioral science, same thing, that we over anchored on experiments and experimentation, and the cousin randomized control trials in the wild. And I think the reason for that is because psychologists and behavioral scientists always struggled to find their real scientist identity. We were born out of a marriage between physiology and philosophy in the late 19th century. And then into the 20th century, there's this really curious and interesting history of the field, which sort of went through psychoanalytic to the behaviorist tradition to the cognitive revolution, and I'm skipping decades here, and then we ended up in the sort of where we are now with neuroscience, social neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and all of that is funneling into this applied behavioral science. And so we're borrowing from all the traditions in academia over the last 100 and 150 years. But the whole experiment thing wasn't always the case in our field. There was other ways to do the science, and we still have that to some degree. We can still collect data. We can still find broad patterns between variables, and of course, those are correlations. But as any person who has taken a Psych 101 class or a Stats 101 class, correlation does not mean causation. So you cannot reliably infer that variable X causes variable Y in any sort of clean or precise way. If you're just merely uncovering a relationship between those two variables, you need, and this is where the experimental method helps, is you need to have a controlled setup with a control condition and an independent variable and a dependent variable, and has to be very clean, and you have to do all the things that a good scientist does when they're running an experiment, and that will get you causality. That will allow you to infer cause and effect. But what we did, I think, and this is the argument they make in the paper, is over the last 20 years, it was like, if you don't have cause and effect, then forget it. We're not going to publish your paper. It's not important. It's too far away from truthiness that we're going to dismiss it. So come back to us when you have evidence of causality, which means go run an experiment and come back. And I think the debate is that's just a new debate in the field. I think we can still do our science, and that sometimes that may include experiments, and sometimes that won't. So that may be qualitative data, it might be quantitative data. So even though I'm sort of waffling because I said a few minutes ago that I love the experimental method and that's my foundation, and yet I'm also saying at the same time there's other ways to go about it. So I will say in short, stay tuned because I don't think we have the answer just yet.
Well, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's waffling so much as, again, you're a fox. Different different things are tools for different situations, right? And I heard a funny thing a while ago, that correlation does not equal causation, but it can wink suggestively at causality, right? Um, and like, I think that that just does speak to what's broader, like on your end, is uh yeah, like, these are all just different forms of evidence, but there's like degrees of truthiness, right? And the prior journal approach, I don't know how much it's changed since then, of just only allowing what feels like an absolute degree of truthiness that comes from an experiment. That might not be the best approach.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And sorry to interrupt. I want to stop you there. I think kind of going back to, we have this like psychologists, behavioral scientists have this physics envy, as I alluded to earlier. We want to be considered a hard science, and like we're going to do our darndest, and we have been fighting that good fight for 50 years to say no, no, we're not philosophy, we're not sociology, we're not anthropology, we're psychology, we're behavioral science. And so to be given that badge, to be awarded that badge, you have to do certain things as the physicists do, as the chemists do, as the biologists do, which is, in this case, run controlled experiments. But that's not, who decided that that's actually better in terms of just like general epistemic, knowledge seeking and knowledge finding. I don't know. It's just one way to look at and understand the world. And so I've to maybe make this a little bit more concrete, and this is a good segue, Rob, with rituals. In my PhD, when I was studying the hell out of rituals, the psychology of rituals, it was very new to the field of psychology. Nobody had studied it ever. There was not a single paper with a keyword where the central focus, at least an empirical paper, certainly an empirical paper, where the central focus was ritual. And this is in psychology. Meanwhile, our sister field, over there, the anthropologists and to some degree the sociologists, were studying the hell out of rituals for all of the 20th century. And it started in 1915 with Emil Durkheim with his book. And what that meant then is, for the next 100 years, or let's say 80 years, since Durkheim, if you were an anthropologist, you were studying ritual and culture in some way. So both fields, the ultimate goal of both fields is to understand human beings and human behavior. Um, and we just do it in different ways, really, right? So with rituals, they were studying it, in the wild. They were doing ethnographies. They were going to actual cultures and seeing what these people did, and how they engaged in ritual, and what it meant for their socialization, and what it meant for their civilization, and what it meant for their culture. And so they weren't running experiments, but they learned a lot, and they had great what's called external validity. And then the psychologists, like myself, would come around and say, that's great, anthropologists. You've learned a lot, but how do you know, when you've answered a question that you've been asking, how do you know that this particular thing is driving the outcome, that you're observing? Well, you don't, because in the wild there are an endless number of variables that are muddying the waters, and what we call confounding or extraneous variables. So it's, yes, you're learning a lot, yes, it's reality as you're capturing it and writing it down and coming up with theories and frameworks, but it's imprecise because you have no idea of cause and effect. So we take the concept, in this case rituals, and we say we're going to do it better, or at least we're going to do it different, and we're going to bring the phenomenon and we're going to bring it into the lab, and we're going to pull on this, push on that, manipulate a variable on the independent variable side, and then have a control condition and see some sort of observed outcome and infer cause and effect. So I did that for 5-6 years. And every time I would run a set of studies, type up a paper, submit it to a journal, and it would undergo the peer review process. Half of the reviewers would be psychologists and share the same worldview and biases as myself and my collaborators, and they'd love it. We'd get raving, glowing reviews. And then the other half of reviewers would be anthropologists, and they would shit all over our paper and say, this isn't ritual. This is just some contrived thing you've created in a weird environment with weird students in a laboratory. Sorry, we're not publishing this. So it's interesting, right? As a concrete example of how people who are claiming to understand human behavior and study it in different ways have such wildly different outlooks on the world.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. I feel like we could do a whole podcast episode or 3 on just that. But I do want to dig in a little bit more on rituals. So first off, I was wondering if you could like define rituals and then maybe tell us how you think about them within the broader domain of the behavioral influence work that you do. Right? Cuz like when I'm thinking about rituals, the only examples I can really think of in the context of like business are things like, you know, Corona, stick a lime in it. And it's literally just normal beer, but everybody sticks a lime in it before, or like having the perfect pour to proceed every time that you drink a Guinness. But I'm not sure if that's really how you're defining rituals. So yeah, I'm again curious
Mm-hmm.
how you define them, what they look like, and how they fit into the work that you do.
Mm-hmm. So I will start first with a disclaimer, which makes my work really interesting, and that is this is so new to the field of applied behavioral insights and behavioral science that there are times where even myself as an expert in ritual, I'm grasping for more examples to round out my narrative or to round out a story that I'm telling, and they're just not there yet. But I hope that as I do this work and others hopefully come on board and do the work, the amazing work that they're doing that's related to rituals in some way, that we will see more examples of it surface and more examples that we can actually point to and talk about. So that is a disclaimer out of the gates, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I came, like I said, in my last response, it was the first published paper in Psychology for Ritual. So this is in academia, was in 2012, which is when I started my PhD. And then my team and I published a bunch of papers over the next 4 or 5 years. But that's only been 7-8 years in academia. So it makes sense that there's a slow uptick for that knowledge and that stuff to come into practice. And that's really my one of my main goals with the work that I do. So there's that. Now, definition, and I have this sort of burned in my brain because when we were working on this theoretical model, which is now this paper in personality social psychology review a couple years ago. So this definition that we and my collaborators came up with is: rituals are predefined sequences characterized by rigidity, formality, and repetition that are embedded in a larger system of symbolism or meaning, which partially lack direct instrumental purpose. So now people are going, what the fuck did you just say?
That's what my reaction was.
So let's break it down. So there's three required features that have to be present in a behavior in order for it to be considered ritual. So one is it has this high sense of rigidity, formality, or repetition. Um, what what I say often is it has a ritual script, and unlike other behaviors, there is very little room for improvisation. You stick to the script, and that's exactly how you do it. Now there are various, and we have actually a paper coming out, a very bright PhD student at Berkeley named Dan Stein or Daniel Stein. He's coming out with a paper in the next couple of months, hopefully, where we talk about the different psychosocial mechanisms um, that are incorporated into ritual to ensure that they stay the same, exactly the same. And we're talking about behaviors here, in some cases, mostly with religions and various cultures, that have remained unchanged for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. Now, just think about that for a second. We just think about how often our societies change, our civilizations change, our technologies change, our businesses, our organizations. I mean, the change of the rate of change in our world is ridiculous, especially in the last 50 years. Despite all of that change that's happening, rituals don't. So that is feature one. And before I go on to feature two, the one last thing I'll say about that is, if it's a collective ritual or a group ritual, there are serious punishment or consequences for trying to change those predefined behaviors or sequences. Now, does it happen? Yes, and it's really interesting when it does happen, but that's a separate point. Number two, the second feature is that it's embedded in a larger system of symbolism and meaning. So often when I talk about these features, I distinguish ritual from other pattern behaviors like routine and habit. Habits aren't necessarily inherently meaningful. They might carry some meaning as it's associated with what the person is doing, like a workout routine or a workout habit. Like they might derive some meaning from being a person who exercises and is into physical fitness, but the behavior itself is not meaningful. Whereas with rituals, it is. Um, and to give you an example, lighting the simple act of lighting a candle, that can, if you don't know, if you're not in the group, if you're not in the know, then you might see that behavior and you're like, oh, it's very practical, it's very instrumental. The person is lighting the candle because they need to, see in the dark, right? So it's not a ritual, but you can see that exact same behavior by the exact same person, and the intention is actually completely non-instrumental or weird and superfluous. And they might light the candle, close their eyes, hold the candle at forehead height, and do some other sort of weird actions, and that carries a great deal of symbolism um, and meaning for them. Third is the one that is, which I kind of alluded to in that past example, is it lacks some direct instrumental purpose. So that's explained by their quirkiness. Rituals are weird. They are on the surface, they are an economic and evolutionary waste. They're effortful. They take time. People do them sometimes for some rituals, in particular in religions, they do them multiple times a day, every day for the majority of their entire life. Sometimes those rituals can be psychologically painful, sometimes physically or physiologically painful. Sometimes it's like seriously, like there's blood involved, pain type pain. So evolutionarily, it's like from an adaptive framework standpoint, you would say, why do people engage in those behaviors? It makes no sense whatsoever, and yet we do, and we do it all the time, and we see it happen all the time. And to that last point, there's this is the work by Christine Lagarde and others and her team, where a few years ago they have a series of papers that are distinguishing between two types of stances that we take in our behavior. There's the instrumental stance and the ritual stance. And the instrumental stance are those behaviors that we do, normally, and they're ordinary, and we just do them, and they are what's called causally transparent. So if you're watching me engage in an instrumental behavior, or you're seeing and I'm in the instrumental stance, my behaviors are taking the instrumental stance, you can understand exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm sort of, let's say I have a lid, a jar with a lid. I'm turning the lid, counterclockwise to the left to loosen the lid, to take it off, to reach inside and grab a piece of food. Let's say that makes sense to you. Cause and effect, Makes sense. Easy, instrumental, practical. And we do those all the time. But then there's these other weird behaviors that we engage in that take the ritual stance, and those are ritual behaviors, where I'm holding that jar, and before I turn the lid counterclockwise to loosen it, I tap it twice with my index finger, and then 3 times with my middle finger, and then I turn it. And before I take the piece of food out, I will actually, I'm making these up. I'll sniff it, close my eyes, and then take the piece of food out and eat it. So there's a series of behaviors in there that don't make any sense, that aren't tied to any sort of causal outcome. They're goal demoted, and they're causally opaque. And it's beautiful because what that means for the behavior and what that means for the transmission of knowledge between people who are involved in that scenario, in that situation, carries a lot of psychological and sociological implications. So I'll stop there. I could go on and bore you to tears, but
Yeah, so I'm curious now that I feel like I'm getting a little bit better of a sense for what you mean by a ritual. I'm curious if this might be an example uh, of designing for them intentionally, right? Like, so like let's say you have a meditation app, right? Like I feel like a lot of app designers, they really prioritize habit, but habits don't really have that much meaning to them. Whereas an act like meditation can be emotional, right? You start off and try to get people into, like, let's say, a routine of, before they open up the meditation app, they sit down, they get comfortable in a certain position, and they put their hands on, like, into the Buddha pose or something. Like, just something specific preceding it. You do the meditation. It generally comes with some wording in it, if it's a guided meditation, that makes it feel like it's a more emotional experience. And then, like, you have things like streak counters and such that give some penalty to not executing on the ritual. Is that like the sort of area where rituals can play into effect, or am I? Yeah, like, I'm curious your thoughts on all that.
yeah, that's a good question. So from like a behavioral design and product design point of view, whether it's a meditation or app or anything else, meditation is an interesting one. But so this more than a lot of people. Like the general principle in this, one of the general principles is reduce friction,
Hmm.
um, and what rituals are is actually friction. So and there's no, like I said in my opening disclaimer, there's actually no at least no applied empirical data which suggests that introducing more friction, if it's sort of a ritualistic related friction, can lead to better outcomes than removing that friction. But that's my hypothesis, is that if you can get a person to engage in a behavior, to adopt the ritual stance when they're engaging, when they're engaging with a product or a service in some way, if you can do that and they recognize or they receive the benefits of it from being a ritual, then my hypothesis is that more friction is better than less, which is very counter to what a lot of people are saying these days. But it's an empirical question, and I'm hoping to test it soon. So with the meditation example, yeah, that's what I think would work, is getting a person to engage in that experience, to have that experience, and maybe it's like like you said, sort of that setup, like the pre-performance ritual, like have something that they do that is very specific. So specificity is a huge component of ritual, and there's 3 or 4 main ones. There's spatial specificity, temporal specificity, and sequence specificity. So spatial specificity is the idea that you do the behavior in the same location every single time, and that's a huge thing in delineating the ritual or the from the non-ritual, or the profane from the mundane, is that there's a clear wall between ordinary life and ritual life, and you have to ceremonialize that wall coming up and coming down, so that okay, I am in a ritual now and I can be weird about it. But when this ritual is done and there's going to be a clear ending to it, I can go on with my ordinary non-ritual actions. So the exact same space, the exact same room, wherever it may be. Temporal specificity is the exact same time, no matter what. So you see that in most religious prayers. So the 5 times a day Islamic prayer, the salat, is done uh, the same time every day for the most part. So that's the second. And then sequence specificity or sequential specificity is that those behaviors that you're doing are done in the exact same order, no matter what. Again, so there's, you can sort of hear this theme that I'm hitting on is that there's this strictness. There's again, back to the definition, there's this rigidity. What a ritual scholar called Catherine Bell, not Kristen Bell, I think that's the actress. Catherine Bell called um, a scrupulous adherence to the rules. And that's the sort of mindset that people who are doing a ritual adopt. So, pulling on those features, I can imagine that in designing different products and apps, it would be easy enough to include those. But we might not think to do it because they seem weird and full of friction, right?
This reminds me of there was some research done by Kathleen DeVos and a few other researchers, um, and and I can send you the paper afterwards. But one of the things that they found was, like, they were looking at rituals before eating food. And one of the things that they ended up finding there was that, like, people who have more of a ritual, which I guess are like more activities before it, etc., they have uh, they end up enjoying the food more. And the experimental mechanism they ended up finding for that was just because it increases the individual's interest and involvement in the activity. So that's really interesting. What I'm hearing also with, like, spatial specificity of, like, divide creating this clearer wall between ordinary life and ceremonial life. Like, I see that in other areas, like the deep work phenomenon, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of writers say, this is my writing room. If I'm in here, I am doing nothing but writing. And they pick the first few hours of every single day to do that. That's also coming to mind. One thing that I'm curious about is that, given just how serious it feels like a ritual is, how do you think that ends up applying to brands?
Huh. Like
How
it
serious
sounds.
and rigid it is, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. There's a bit of a paradox there, um, because especially nowadays, brands are told like they're supposed to be sort of flexible and fluid, and it's supposed to cater to the user and to the customer, and it's supposed to be delightful and fun, and all the things that we typically hear in brand engagement and product experience. And yeah, you're right. There is this tone with ritual that is serious and rigid and not fun. So I think it would have to be a balance that they strike there. So maybe, just as an example, maybe it is not the entire experience with the product or service is ritualized, but just one particular component. Could be one example, and keeping it light, like keeping it not so effortful right out of the gates, so that, like, because we were saying, there's going to be more friction involved, but like the types of rituals that we're doing in customer experience and in employee experience as well, they're not going to be like the religious rituals, right? Like there's not going to be like self-flagellation, and there's not going to be like you have to pray half an hour 5 times a day, right? No, that's not going to be the case. It might be just a little thing you do with, let's say, health and beauty is a great space for ritualizing product experiences. So it might be just that face washing ritual, moisturizing ritual that you do every morning when you wake up, before you get out the door, and every night before you go to bed. And tied to that 3-minute sort of sequence is these very specific features that may be seen as sort of overly rigid, but are important and significant and meaningful to you no less. So that is sort of one way we could get around the problem of the rigidity and the seriousness part. And one more thing to add to that is this is other work by some folks over in Denmark, I believe, over the last few years. And they've asked the question, which maybe a lot of listeners and maybe yourself as well, Rob, are wondering about. And that's, what's the difference between an individual ritual versus a collective ritual? Because we do see both happen all the time. And what their findings show is that collective rituals or group rituals, rituals that are shared between people of any group size, are far more functional and far more adaptive versus the individual rituals. Individual rituals are the ones that actually can be dangerous and lead to more disruptive behaviors and damaging behaviors associated with psychopathology, like obsessive compulsive disorder. And also there's autism spectrum disorder is also marked by different behaviors, ritualized or ritualistic behaviors. So I don't I don't believe that all ritual is good. I think we have to be careful with it, because if not set up in the right way, a ritual is simply something that becomes a crutch, something that a person believes is going to alleviate their anxiety when in fact it's not. And then it gets into this sort of like vicious cycle and never-ending loop is with which is what you see with OCD. So what they say is with rituals, and I do believe this in the customer experience and in brand engagement, there needs to be some sort of what they call collective or cultural prior, right? So as an example, let's think Oreo is the one that people love citing and talking about as an example. I think it's for since the 1950s. There's always been this Oreo ritual, which is like you twist, you lick, you dunk, and there's like it's actually like a 5-step sequence of behaviors that you do. That could be considered a consumption or like a consumer related ritual, but it's shared among all people. So if I do my Oreo ritual and I'm alone, I'm doing it by myself, the mere knowledge that there's other people doing it out there, even people I don't know, is enough for me to get that meaning and to get that significance in order for it to become, in my mind anyway, a group ritual, even though I'm doing it alone. So for a lesson in that is for brands and for products is you can get people to do their own ritual, and you can even have them introduce their own little quirks and their own little touches to it to personalize it. But it's really important that you get the message across in that experience that they're sharing in that experience with other people, with other consumers, because that's so important to derive the meaning element and to keep the bad part of ritual away.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is one of the things I love about you, right? You're a fox. I mean, let's just examine what happened here. You are selling a product offering that's related to ritual, but you still refuse to say that rituals are useful for every specific situation because you're epistemically honest. Like more about rituals than probably just about anyone else. And you're able to say, here are the situations where I think it's right for a product or for a brand, and here are the situations where I don't think it's right. And that is what would make me trust you with ritualizing my product more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that, and you're right. If and this happened to me actually twice so far, where somebody came to me like a prospect, and I quickly learned that they wanted to ritualize the experience for the wrong reasons, and that there was just more risk involved than I was happy with or willing to take. Because the thing is, and I say this as one of my sort of taglines, is that ritualize the experience and you have a customer for life. I think that's true. But I only want that to be true if the customer is deriving benefit from that experience and that they want to be a customer for life. I want to still have, like, I don't want to like trick them into developing this ritual and then they feel trapped by it, because of that rigidity, because of that stickiness, that is there more than any other behavior we know. I really want it to. I really want that experience to be good for the user and for the customer, and something that they are, opting into themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've got one more question for you.
Yeah.
I think you know what's coming. Uh, it's the big behavioral question. Uh,
Brainstorm, Rob.
Big behavioral brainstorm. The three. Okay, yeah, you caught me. Same idea.
Same idea.
what
Yeah.
what what do you think's the biggest problem that behavioral science and maybe even your specific brand of behavioral science can address?
Well, thanks, Rob, for asking that. Um, I've been thinking a lot about meaning lately. Um, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this off air, but now we're of course on air, so I'm going to share it with whomever's made it to this point in the conversation. So I've been thinking a lot about meaning, and we are excuse the term I'm using here, but a meaning epidemic and maybe even a meaning pandemic. Uh, and we see that as evidenced by the surge in, and I mean this is outside of COVID-19 times, but we see that as evidenced by a surge in mental health problems and mental illness worldwide. So the incidence and the prevalence rates of anxiety, depression, mood disorders, suicide, you name it, is growing and is much higher than it was even 5-10 years ago. And there's a number of factors. There's a number of explanations. Obviously, it's a complex thing, and so I don't pretend to say it's only one thing. But the one thing that I'm focusing on is that I believe there's a lack of purpose and meaning in people's lives. Which is a weird thing, right? When you think about it, because we are creatures of comfort. We have everything. And I'm generalizing, like, I know there's people out there, trust me, I know there's people out there who are not so well off and are in dire straits, especially nowadays. But generally, compared to the past, and Steven Pinker has made this argument in one of his books, we're doing so well as a species and as a society. We're the richest we've ever been. We are technologically advanced to provide us with things that we could have never, ever, in our wildest dreams, imagined, even 40 years ago, let alone like 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So we're doing so well in the grand scheme of things. And yet that isn't matching our our mental reality, our psychological reality. A lot of us feel like we're in crisis all the time. And that is a terrible thing. And it keeps me up at night and I don't like it. And so the next part of my sort of thesis, proposition 2, is that the biggest source of meaning for humans um, for the last hundred thousands of years has been mostly religion or myth, whatever you want to call it. And so factor number 2 we're seeing is that the rates of religiosity are dropping fastest as they ever at the fastest rate we've seen. So atheism is growing worldwide, especially in Western countries. And so what I believe, and I believe this to be true, is that we have a hole, a sort of a meaning hole that we aren't filling because we're not adopting our parents' religions or our grandparents' religions. We're saying it's not for us. And then how do we fill that? Where do we go to fill that? Because religion is such an amazing tool for meaning, but there's arguments to be made that we as a species have sort of outgrown it. And gosh, trust me, I know I could have that debate with very smart people that's not the case, but I think it is the case. at any rate, we need to find something else in our lives to fill that void, that meaning void. And I do believe that it lies in work and in consumer experiences. And that might seem like very capitalistic of me and an evil thing for me to say, but I say it because I think we can actually be so much better in the work that we do for as employees and as customers and consumers. And this is why I love behavioral insights and sort of generally the human-centric design to product and service experiences, is that they take the human into account. They think of, empathy as, if you're thinking about like sort of the design thinking process. We're considering the needs of humans as employees and customers, which is great. And the second is because we spend so much of our waking hours at work and or consuming and engaging with products. So why not have that be the thing that is actually helping to fill that meaning void? So that is my mission over the next lifetime, let's say. And I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, and I do believe that behavioral science can be at least just one of the tools that we use to address that very big problem.
I think you're right. Yeah, that sounds right.
Well, thanks. It is. I think it's a provocative point, and I think it would make a lot of people angry, especially my religious family members. But it's an amazing, at least in my mind, I find it such an amazing thing to think about and to just like debate and unpack. And there's so much in there that I could go on forever. But I think there's a lot of nuance to it for sure.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Nick. This was I think this was absolutely fascinating. I learned a ton from this. I'm going to spend the next like 20-30 minutes just writing down what I think some of my takeaways were, because this was fantastic. Thanks for doing this.
Well, the thanks is all mine, Rob. This was your idea, and I hope listeners get a lot out of it from your wonderful questions and from my rambling answers. But really, really appreciate you coming to me with the idea and setting aside time to do it. I think I said that last night, 11:30. I was like, hey, how was tomorrow? Let's do this. So I really appreciate it, Rob.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.